Millionaire's daughter shocks everyone. That waitress, she's my mom. That shocking sentence didn't just silence a crowded restaurant. It shattered the carefully built life of one of the wealthiest men in the city. But who was this mysterious waitress? Why would a little girl recognize her as her own mother? And how could such an innocent declaration expose secrets that had been buried for years? Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, you'll uncover a story that's about far more than money. It's about betrayal and heartbreak, yes, but it's also about second chances, forgiveness, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Before that shocking night, the world of Victor Ellison seemed perfect. To outsiders, he had it all. Towering skyscrapers with his name engraved on them, a fleet of luxury cars, and a reputation as one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. But his proudest treasure wasn't in his bank account. It was his daughter, Sophie. Sophie was only 9 years old, but she carried herself with a confidence and charm that made her the center of any room. With bright eyes, quick laughter, and a curiosity that seemed endless, she was her father's whole world. Victor often told his business partners, half-jokingly, that his billions meant nothing compared to the joy he found when Sophie ran into his arms at the end of the day. She was the light in his otherwise calculated, ruthless life. But like every light, Sophie's brightness cast shadows Victor rarely acknowledged. It was a crisp autumn evening when Victor decided to take Sophie to one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The kind of place where the chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, the waiters moved silently in tailored uniforms, and every guest whispered so as not to disturb the air of wealth and refinement. Victor wasn't there just for the food. He was meeting with important investors, men and women who could push his empire into its next great expansion. To impress them, he brought Sophie along. She was his secret weapon, the sweet, innocent daughter who softened his sharp edges and reminded people that even billionaires could be human. That night, Sophie wore a pale blue dress with a ribbon in her hair. She twirled around in the mirror before they left, and Victor, with a rare, tender smile, told her she looked like a princess. She beamed, clutching his hand tightly as they entered the grand dining room. The table was already set with gleaming silverware and crystal glasses. Investors rose to shake Victor's hand, their polite smiles widening when they saw Sophie. Everyone loved her instantly, as always. For the first half of the evening, everything went exactly as planned. Victor spoke confidently about profits and projections, while Sophie sat quietly, sketching little flowers on her napkin and sneaking glances at the dessert tray carried by waiters. Laughter echoed around the table. Wine flowed, and Victor allowed himself to relax. It was supposed to be a flawless night. But then, she appeared. Carrying a tray of appetizers, a woman in her mid-30s stepped up to their table. She wore the standard black and white uniform of the restaurant, her hair tied neatly back, her face calm and professional. To most people there, she was invisible, just another waitress, but not to Sophie. The moment the waitress leaned down to place a dish in front of her, Sophie froze. Her wide eyes locked onto the woman's face, studying it with an intensity far beyond her years. The woman noticed and gave a small, polite smile, before quickly moving on to the next guest. Sophie's heart began to pound. She couldn't look away. Something about the woman felt familiar. Victor didn't notice at first. He was too busy charming his investors, raising his glass in a toast. But Sophie barely touched her food. She kept stealing glances at the waitress, her mind racing, her little hands gripping the edge of the table. Children have instincts that adults often ignore. They see connections we've trained ourselves not to see. And that night, Sophie's instincts told her she knew this woman, knew her in a way that went beyond memory, beyond reason. As the evening wore on, the investors began to discuss numbers too boring for Sophie to follow. Her eyes drifted again toward the waitress, who now stood across the room jotting down an order. Sophie leaned closer to her father, tugging on his sleeve. She whispered, "Daddy." Victor didn't look at her. "Yes, sweetheart?" Her voice was soft, almost trembling. "That waitress? She's my mom." At first, Victor thought he'd misheard. He laughed nervously, brushing it off as one of Sophie's wild imaginations. "What are you talking about, darling?" But Sophie wasn't smiling. Her eyes were wide, serious. She repeated louder this time, drawing the attention of people nearby. "That waitress is my mom!" The room fell silent. Glasses froze in midair. Forks clinked onto plates. Every investor at the table turned their head first to Sophie, then to Victor, then to the waitress, who had stopped in her tracks, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. Victor's smile faltered. The color drained from his cheeks. He felt the weight of 100 eyes on him waiting for his response. And in that moment, the perfect image he had built, the billionaire father, the flawless family, the controlled life, cracked. But Sophie wasn't done. She stood up from her chair, her little voice ringing clear in the hushed room. "I know it's her. She looks just like me." The waitress's hand trembled. A plate nearly slipped from her tray. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hide. And in that silence, every secret Victor had tried to bury began to claw its way back to the surface.
The silence that followed Sophie's words felt like it lasted forever. In reality, only a few seconds passed, but to Victor, each tick of the clock struck like a hammer against his chest. His investors stared at him, their polished smiles now twisted into expressions of confusion and intrigue. They whispered to each other, trading glances at the waitress who stood frozen near the table. Victor cleared his throat, forcing a smile back onto his face. "She's just tired," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand at Sophie. "Kids say the strangest things." But Sophie didn't back down. She climbed onto her chair, her small frame trembling, but her voice firm. "No, Daddy, I'm not joking. That woman is my mom." Every eye turned to the waitress again. Her tray wobbled in her hands. She looked as though the ground had given way beneath her. And for a fleeting second, her eyes met Sophie's. It was enough. A spark of recognition passed between them, the kind that doesn't need words, doesn't need proof. It was raw, undeniable. Victor shot up from his seat, so fast that his chair toppled over with a loud crash. "That's enough, Sophie," his voice thundered through the restaurant, startling guests at nearby tables. "Sit down this instant." But Sophie's lip trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. She shook her head stubbornly. "No, Daddy, I know it's her. I can feel it." The waitress, Eleanor, stood frozen. Her co-workers watched her nervously from across the room. One of the managers stepped forward as if to intervene, but she lifted a hand slightly, signaling him to stay back. Because, deep down, she knew. She had known from the moment she laid eyes on Sophie. The little girl's round cheeks, the dimple that appeared when she pouted, the shade of her eyes Eleanor had once gazed into as an infant. She had tried to bury this truth for years, but now here it was, dragged into the open by a child's innocent voice. Eleanor's lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. She simply stood there, trembling, her hands gripping the tray until her knuckles turned white. Victor felt his palms growing slick with sweat. He looked at Eleanor, really looked, for the first time, and suddenly, beneath the waitress's plain uniform and weary expression, she saw her. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had lost. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak, but the words died on his tongue. If he admitted recognition here, in front of his investors, the story would spread like wildfire. And worse, Sophie would start asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. So he did what powerful men often do when cornered, he denied. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "She's no one, just a server. Sophie, apologize right now." But Sophie's voice broke through his anger. "I won't. I know it's her. She looks just like me. Daddy, why didn't you tell me?" The investors shifted uncomfortably. Whispers grew louder. Forks clinked nervously against plates. The illusion of control Victor had spent years perfecting was unraveling right before their eyes. Finally, Eleanor set down her tray on a nearby table. Her hands shook as she stepped closer, her eyes glistening. The air seemed to thicken with every step she took towards Sophie. She crouched down so she was level with the little girl. Her voice trembled, but carried across the room with haunting clarity. "Sophie," she whispered, her lip quivering. "You're right." Gasps erupted around the table. Victor's eyes went wide. He wanted to shout, to stop her, but he couldn't move. His feet felt glued to the floor. Sophie's tears spilled over, but her face lit up with hope. "I knew it," she said softly, reaching out her tiny hand. Eleanor pressed her trembling fingers against Sophie's just for a moment before pulling back as if burned. I shouldn't be here," she stammered. "I didn't want it to happen like this." Victor's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough! Don't you dare!" But it was too late. The truth had slipped free. Chaos erupted. Investors exchanged stunned looks, whispering furiously. The restaurant manager hurried forward, apologizing profusely to Victor, but the damage was already done. Sophie clung to Eleanor's sleeve. "Don't go, please. You're my mom, aren't you?" Eleanor's heart shattered. She couldn't bring herself to deny it, not with those pleading eyes staring into hers. Yes, Sophie, I'm your mother." The entire restaurant seemed to gasp in unison. Victor's vision blurred with rage and fear. He grabbed Sophie's arm, pulling her back. "That's enough!" His voice shook. "You don't know what you're saying." But Sophie fought against his grip, sobbing, "I hate you, Daddy! You kept her from me!" The words cut deeper than any business betrayal ever could. Victor's chest ached as he sank back into his chair, his empire forgotten, his investors forgotten. All that mattered was the look in his daughter's eyes, a look of betrayal he knew he might never erase. And so, what began as a dinner meant to impress turned into the night everything unraveled. The investors would leave with rumors. The restaurant staff would whisper for weeks. And Victor, he would be left with a single haunting truth. The past he thought he buried had just walked back into his life, and his daughter now knew it. But who was Eleanor really? Why had she disappeared from Victor's life all those years ago? And what secrets was she still hiding? Stay with me, because the answers will shake this family to its core.
The ride home from the restaurant was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, but inside Victor's luxury car, the atmosphere was suffocating. Sophie sat with her arms crossed, her tear-streaked face turned stubbornly toward the window. Victor opened his mouth several times to speak, but each time the words withered before they left his lips. When they finally pulled up to the mansion's iron gates, Sophie bolted from the car before the driver could even open her door. She sprinted inside, ignoring Victor's calls. The sound of her small feet pounding up the marble staircase echoed through the vast halls. Victor stood in the entryway, his chest heavy. For the first time in years, the house felt unbearably empty.
Amelia's portrait still hung over the fireplace, a reminder of the love he once lost. And now, Eleanor, the ghost of another past, resurrected by a child's innocent words. Across town, Eleanor sat on the edge of her small apartment bed, still in her waitress uniform. Her hands trembled as she stared at the cracked ceiling. She could still feel Sophie's tiny hand tugging at hers. She could still hear her voice, "You're my mom, aren't you?" Eleanor pressed her palms to her face and wept. Years ago, she had made the hardest decision of her life, to walk away, to disappear so Sophie could have a future she could never provide. Victor had been furious, but also determined. He promised Sophie would be cared for, that she would want for nothing. Eleanor had convinced herself it was the right choice, but seeing her again tonight, alive and beautiful and so much like the baby she had held in her arms once, tore open wounds that had never truly healed. She whispered into the quiet room as though Sophie could hear her, "I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." Back at the mansion, Sophie refused to come down for dinner. She locked herself in her room, clutching the teddy bear she'd had since she was 3 years old. Her mind spun with questions. Why had her father lied? Why had he hidden her mother? Why had he made her believe she was gone forever? Finally, she crept into her father's study. Victor sat at his massive oak desk, staring blankly at an untouched glass of whiskey. The room smelled of old books and regret. "Daddy," Sophie said softly. He looked up, his eyes tired. "Yes, sweetheart." Her voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me my mom was alive?" Victor closed his eyes. For years, he had rehearsed explanations in his head, but none of them seemed good enough now. He sighed deeply. "It's complicated, Sophie. Your mother, Eleanor, she left. She made a choice. I wanted to protect you from that pain." Sophie's fists clenched. "But you lied to me. You said she was gone forever. You made me think I didn't have a mom." Victor's voice cracked. "I thought it was best. I thought if you never knew, you wouldn't feel abandoned." Sophie's tears spilled over again. "But I do feel abandoned by both of you." The words hit Victor like a blade. He reached for her, but she pulled away, running from the room. That night, long after Sophie had fallen asleep, Victor sat awake in his study, staring at the flames in the fireplace. His mind replayed the restaurant scene over and over. Eleanor was back, but why? What had driven her to take a waitress job in his city, so close to Sophie? Was it chance, or was fate forcing him to face the past he had buried? Finally, he grabbed his coat. If he wanted answers, there was only one place to go. Eleanor jumped when the knock rattled her apartment door. She wiped her eyes quickly, composing herself before opening it, but when she saw Victor standing there in his tailored suit, fury flashing in his eyes, her breath caught. "Victor," she whispered. He stepped inside without asking. "What were you thinking?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You show up at my dinner, humiliate me in front of my investors, and tell Sophie—" "I didn't tell her anything," Eleanor snapped, her own anger rising. "She recognized me. I couldn't deny her." Victor's jaw clenched. "You had no right." Her laugh was bitter. "No right? She's my daughter, Victor, my blood. You took her from me. I gave her a life you never could, a mansion, education, security. Do you know what would have happened if I'd left her with you, struggling in some tiny apartment, working 2 jobs just to feed her? That's not a life for my daughter." Tears burned Eleanor's eyes, but she stood her ground. And what about love, Victor? What about a mother's arms to hold her when she cries? You can't buy that. You can't replace that with money. His silence was answer enough. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor lowered her gaze, her voice breaking. You don't know everything, Victor. The night I left, it wasn't just about poverty. I was scared. I was being followed. Followed? By who? Her lips trembled. By people who wanted money. People who knew you. They threatened me. They threatened Sophie. I thought if I disappeared, they would stop. Victor's eyes widened. You should have told me. I couldn't. Eleanor's voice cracked. You were already under so much pressure. I thought leaving was the only way to keep her safe. Victor staggered back, the weight of her words crashing over him. All these years he had painted her as a coward, as selfish, but now the truth revealed something entirely different. She hadn't abandoned Sophie, she had sacrificed herself. Unbeknownst to them, Sophie had crept out of bed and followed her father. She stood just outside the apartment door, listening through the crack. Her heart pounded as she heard her mother's voice, trembling, raw and full of love. For the first time she understood. Her mother hadn't stopped loving her. She had left to protect her. Tears rolled down Sophie's cheeks as she whispered to herself, She did love me. She never stopped. Victor turned toward the door ready to leave, but Eleanor grabbed his sleeve. Please, she begged, don't take her away from me again. Let me be in her life. His jaw tightened. He looked into her desperate eyes, torn between anger and the undeniable truth that Sophie needed her mother. Finally, he said, We'll talk about this. But if you hurt her again, Eleanor, I swear. Before he could finish, Sophie pushed open the door, tears streaming down her face. Daddy, stop! She ran into Eleanor's arms, burying her face in her mother's chest. Eleanor held her tightly, sobbing into her hair. And Victor, for the first time, realized he was no longer in control. The past and the present had collided, and the future would never be the same.
The mansion felt different the next morning. The walls that had once echoed with Sophie's laughter now carried a silence so heavy it pressed down on Victor's chest. At breakfast, the long dining table looked more like a battlefield than a family setting. Sophie sat at one end, still puffy-eyed from crying, stabbing at her food without eating. Victor sat across from her, watching in silence, unsure how to bridge the gulf between them. Finally, he spoke. Sophie, I know last night was confusing, but you need to understand, I've only ever wanted what's best for you. Sophie didn't look up. You lied to me. The words landed like a hammer. Victor swallowed hard. I didn't mean to hurt you. I wanted to protect you. Sophie's fork clattered against her plate as she looked up, her eyes burning with anger. Protect me? From what? From knowing my mom loved me? From feeling like I belonged to someone besides you? Victor had no answer. He sat in silence, his empire of excuses crumbling under the weight of a child's truth. Later that afternoon, a hesitant knock echoed through the mansion. When the butler opened the door, Eleanor stood there, clutching a worn handbag, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Victor stiffened when he saw her. Why are you here? He asked coldly. Before Eleanor could answer, Sophie bolted from the staircase and threw herself into her mother's arms. You came, she cried, clinging tightly. Eleanor hugged her back, her own tears flowing freely. I couldn't stay away. Victor's jaw tightened. He wanted to order Eleanor out, to shield Sophie from more chaos, but one look at his daughter's face, lit with joy for the first time since last night, silenced him. Against every instinct, he allowed Eleanor inside. The three of them sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. Sophie nestled close to Eleanor, refusing to let go of her hand. Victor folded his arms. "Sophie, give us a moment. I need to speak with your mother alone." But Sophie shook her head. "No, if you talk, I'm staying. I want to know everything." Eleanor squeezed Sophie's hand and nodded. "She deserves the truth, Victor." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Fine, but don't twist the story." Eleanor's voice was calm but firm. "There's no twisting needed. Sophie, I left because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. Your father's world is powerful, but it's dangerous too. I was being followed, threatened. I thought disappearing was the only way to protect you." Sophie's brow furrowed. "But why didn't you come back sooner?" Eleanor's voice cracked. "Because I was afraid. Afraid they'd still be watching. Afraid your father wouldn't let me near you. And because I didn't think I was worthy of being your mom after all those years." Sophie leaned against her, whispering, "You are worthy. You're my mom." Victor's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to remind Sophie of all the nights he stayed awake with her, all the sacrifices he made, but deep down, he knew nothing could erase the bond between mother and daughter. That evening, as Sophie played upstairs with Eleanor by her side, Victor retreated to his study. His phone buzzed with messages from investors, business partners, even reporters. The story of the restaurant scandal had spread faster than wildfire. One investor's text cut deep. "If you can't control your family, how can you control this company?" Victor slammed the phone down in frustration. For the first time, he realized his carefully crafted image wasn't just cracked, it was shattering. And it wasn't just about business anymore. Eleanor's reappearance threatened the one thing he cared about more than his empire, his daughter's trust. Days passed in uneasy rhythm. Eleanor began visiting the mansion more often, sometimes staying late into the evening. She helped Sophie with homework, cooked simple meals in the massive kitchen, and filled the house with a warmth it hadn't felt in years. Sophie thrived under her mother's presence. Her laughter returned, her curiosity bloomed, and she seemed lighter somehow, as though a missing piece of her soul had been restored. But for Victor, the sight was bittersweet. He stood in the doorway one evening, watching Sophie and Eleanor bake cookies, their faces dusted with flour as they giggled together. The scene was beautiful, but it left him feeling like an outsider in his own home. When Sophie caught him watching, she beamed. "Daddy, come help us!" He smiled faintly, but shook his head. "Maybe later." And he walked away, the sound of their laughter chasing him down the hall like a reminder of everything he had almost lost. One night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Victor and Eleanor sat in the garden under the stars. The air between them was heavy with things unsaid. "She looks so much like you," Eleanor whispered, her eyes glistening. Victor nodded. "She has your stubbornness." For a moment they both smiled, but the smile faded quickly. Victor's tone hardened. "Eleanor, I need to know something. Was it really danger that made you leave? Or was it something else?" Eleanor looked at him, her voice breaking. "I never stopped loving her, Victor. I never stopped, but I was drowning. The threats, the pressure, the fear of never being enough, it consumed me. Leaving felt like the only way to keep her alive, even if it killed me inside." Victor stared at her, torn between anger and understanding. For years, he had believed she had abandoned them out of weakness, but now, hearing the raw truth in her voice, he realized her sacrifice had been far greater than he ever allowed himself to see. One night, as Sophie awoke from a nightmare, tears streaking her face, Eleanor rushed to her room, holding her close until her trembling eased. "I dreamed you left again," she whispered, clinging tightly. Eleanor kissed her forehead. "I promise, sweetheart. I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Victor stood silently in the doorway, watching. A pang of guilt tore through him. He had tried to give Sophie everything, but he could never give her that, the comfort of a mother's embrace. But outside the gates of the mansion, shadows stirred. The same threats Eleanor had feared years ago were creeping back. Whispers of blackmail, old debts, and dangerous men who knew too much about Victor's empire began to resurface. And as Sophie clung tighter to her mother, Victor realized something chilling. Letting Eleanor back into their lives hadn't just reopened old wounds. It had reopened old dangers.
The days that followed felt like stolen time. Sophie thrived with her mother back in her life. She laughed more, slept peacefully, and carried a lightness Victor hadn't seen in years. But beneath the warmth, a storm was building. It started subtly. A black car idling too long near the gates. A phone call that went silent as soon as Victor answered. The butler swore he saw a man in a leather jacket watching the mansion from across the street. Victor brushed it off at first. Coincidence, he muttered, though unease gnawed at him. Eleanor, however, recognized the signs immediately. One evening, she stood by the window, her hands gripping the curtain tightly as she stared out at the street. "They're back," she whispered. Victor turned sharply. "Who?" "The same people, the ones who threatened me years ago. I told you, they never really go away." While her parents whispered in corners, Sophie remained blissfully unaware. She spent her afternoons reading stories with Eleanor, drawing pictures of the three of them together, and begging Victor to join in their games. One night, after tucking Sophie into bed, Eleanor found a drawing under her pillow. It showed a smiling stick figure family, Sophie in the middle, holding hands with Mom and Dad. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "She just wants us together." Victor, standing behind her, sighed heavily. And that's exactly what makes us vulnerable. It happened on a rainy night. Victor had just returned from a tense board meeting when he found an envelope waiting on his desk. No address, no stamp, just his name scrawled across it. Inside was a single photograph, Eleanor walking Sophie home from school. And on the back, written in red ink, "She belongs to us too. Pay up or lose her." Victor's blood ran cold. He clenched the photo in his fist, his vision blurring with rage. He had faced cutthroat businessmen, hostile takeovers, and political enemies, but nothing terrified him like this. He stormed into the living room where Eleanor was reading with Sophie. He held up the photo, his voice shaking. "Explain this!" Eleanor's face drained of color. She took the photo in trembling hands. "It's them again," she whispered. "They've found me again." Sophie looked between them, confused. "Daddy? Mommy? What's wrong?" Victor forced a smile for her sake. "Nothing, sweetheart. Go upstairs for a bit." Sophie frowned, but obeyed. The moment she was gone, Victor exploded. "You should have told me sooner! You brought this into our lives!" Eleanor's voice cracked. "I told you they were dangerous. I left years ago to protect her from this very thing." Victor slammed his fist on the table, "And now, because of you, she's in more danger than ever." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. "Don't you dare blame me. I carried this burden alone for years. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to miss her first words, her first steps, her first day of school? I sacrificed everything to keep her safe." Victor's rage faltered. Beneath her trembling voice was a truth he couldn't ignore. That night, Victor called his most trusted security advisor, Mark, a former military man who had protected the family for years. Mark examined the photo carefully. "This isn't just intimidation. They've been watching closely, which means they're bold and dangerous." Victor clenched his jaw. "Then we make them regret it." Eleanor looked at him in alarm. "Violence isn't the answer, Victor. That's what they want, to drag you into their world. We have to think of Sophie first." Victor met her gaze, his eyes softening. "I am thinking of Sophie. I'll burn the world down before I let anyone touch her."
The next day, Sophie noticed the tension. She overheard hushed arguments, saw the guards posted at the gates, and felt the weight of fear pressing down on her parents. One night, she burst into their room crying, "Are they going to take me away?" Eleanor pulled her into her arms immediately. "No, sweetheart, never. We won't let that happen." Victor knelt in front of her, his hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. That's my promise." But even as he said it, a voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Can you really keep her safe this time?" The pressure mounted. Investors were losing faith, whispers of scandal spread, and now the safety of his daughter was on the line. One evening, Victor sat alone in his study, staring at the flames in the fireplace. His empire, his reputation, his family, everything was slipping through his fingers. And then, as though fate were mocking him, his phone buzzed. Another message. This time, a video. Sophie's schoolyard, filmed from afar, her laughter carried through the grainy audio. And then, a man's voice. "One mistake, and she's gone." Victor's hands shook as he slammed the phone down. For the first time in his life, the billionaire who controlled everything felt utterly powerless. That night, Eleanor found him hunched over in the study, his face buried in his hands. "Victor," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes raw. "I don't know how to fight this. Money, power, none of it matters if I can't keep her safe." Eleanor knelt beside him, taking his trembling hands in hers. "You don't have to fight it alone anymore. For years, I carried this fear by myself, but now we carry it together. For Sophie." For the first time, Victor let his walls down. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her tightly, not as an enemy, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as the mother of his child, the woman who had sacrificed everything. But outside, beyond the mansion gates, danger lurked closer than either of them realized. A figure in a dark coat stood beneath the trees, watching the house with unblinking eyes. He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating a scar across his cheek. He exhaled smoke into the night and muttered, "Soon."
The mansion stood quiet under the cloak of night, but Victor couldn't sleep. He paced the halls like a caged lion, the memory of that video replaying endlessly in his mind. Sophie's laughter, the shadowy voice whispering threats. At last, unable to stand the silence, he went to Sophie's room. She slept soundly, curled against her teddy bear, her hair a halo around her face. For a moment, Victor's heart softened, but just beneath the tenderness burned something sharper. Fury. No one would take his daughter, not while he still drew breath. The attack came sooner than expected. It was just past midnight when the mansion's alarms blared. Security cameras caught movement near the gates, dark figures scaling the iron bars. Guards rushed to intercept, but two men slipped past, fast and ruthless. Victor grabbed the handgun he kept locked in his desk drawer and raced down the hall. Eleanor appeared from Sophie's room, clutching her daughter tightly. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "They're here," she whispered. "Stay with her," Victor ordered. "Don't let her out of your sight." Eleanor shook her head. "You can't do this alone." For a brief second, their eyes locked. Victor saw the same fire that had once drawn him to her, the courage beneath the fear. He gave a single nod. "Then we end this together." The intruders made it as far as the main hall before Victor confronted them. They were masked, armed with knives, their eyes glinting with malice. "This is your only warning," Victor growled, his voice echoing through the cavernous hall. "Leave now."
One of them laughed, a cold, rasping sound. "You think money protects you, Ellison? She's worth more than you know. Hand over the girl." Eleanor stepped forward, her arms still wrapped around Sophie. "Over my dead body." The second intruder lunged. Victor fired a warning shot into the marble floor. The sound deafening. Dust and chips of stone exploded into the air. "Try me," he snarled. Sophie clung to Eleanor, trembling. But then she lifted her head, her voice trembling yet fierce. "You'll never take me. My mom and dad are here. You can't win." Her small but defiant words froze the intruders for just a beat, long enough for Victor's guards to storm into the hall. A struggle erupted, fists, shouts, the crash of furniture breaking. Victor shielded Eleanor and Sophie, keeping them close until the men were finally subdued, their masks torn away, their faces exposed under the harsh light. One of them, the scarred man from the shadows, spat at Victor's feet. "This isn't over. People like you always pay." Victor didn't flinch. "Maybe, but not with my daughter's life." Police sirens wailed outside minutes later, red and blue lights painting the mansion walls. The intruders were dragged away in handcuffs, their threats still echoing in the night. Inside, Sophie refused to let go of Eleanor's hand. Her small fingers clung so tightly it almost hurt. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You didn't let go. You promised." "And I never will." Eleanor kissed her forehead. Victor watched them, his chest heavy. For years he had believed he could control everything, business, life, even love, by sheer force of will. But tonight, it was Sophie's love for her mother and Eleanor's courage that saved them. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed. Not in its appearance. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled, but in its atmosphere. Where once there had been tension and silence, there was laughter again. Sophie insisted that Eleanor move in forever, and for the first time, Victor didn't resist. He still struggled with his pride, with years of anger buried deep. But little by little, walls crumbled. He joined them in the kitchen, even daring to bake cookies with Sophie and Eleanor. He sat with them in the garden, watching Sophie chase fireflies, the glow lighting up her smile. And one evening, as the sun set in hues of gold and pink, Victor admitted the words he had never thought he'd say again. "I was wrong." Eleanor looked at him, surprised. He continued softly. "About you, about everything. You didn't abandon her. You saved her. And I see that now." Her eyes filled with tears. "All I ever wanted was to love her." "Then love her here. With me. With us." One night, Sophie pulled her parents close as they tucked her into bed. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. "Of course," Eleanor said. Sophie's voice was sleepy but certain. "I don't care about mansions or money. I don't care about Daddy's business meetings or Mommy's job. All I care about is that we're together. That's what makes us a family." Her words hung in the air like a blessing. Victor kissed her forehead. "Then that's what we'll be. Always." Eleanor whispered, "Always." Weeks later, they gathered in the garden. At Sophie's insistence, they planted a cherry blossom tree, a symbol of new beginnings. Before covering the roots with soil, Sophie placed 3 objects in the earth. The napkin Eleanor had once scribbled promises on, a drawing Victor had saved from Sophie's early years, and Sophie's bracelet woven from colorful beads. Together, they buried the past and planted the future. As they stood hand in hand, Sophie beamed up at them. Now we'll grow together, just like this tree. Victor and Eleanor exchanged a look, unspoken understanding passing between them. For all the pain, all the loss, all the fear, this was their second chance. The threats would fade, the whispers would die down, and the business world would eventually move on. But none of that mattered. What mattered was Sophie's laughter echoing through the halls. What mattered was the warmth of Eleanor's hand in his. What mattered was a family, broken once, now whole again. Victor had once believed money was power. Now, standing beneath the cherry blossoms, he finally understood. The greatest wealth he had ever possessed was love.